Okay, I would like to provide a little bit of an update for the people who are following disclosure. I wrote Managing Magic, where I talked about what I believed is a gradual disclosure plan by the US government. One of the key people that I refer to in the book is Dr. Ronald Pandolfi. And there's been some recent developments that just happened that I don't really know what's going on, but he's actually taken to actually posting material now. Most of the material previously was being released through puppet type figures like Dan Smith, and now Dan Smith seems to have disappeared, and Ron is actually posting. And what actually happened was, in the last couple of weeks, Ron has actually posted to a site called Open Minds Forum, which I had even given up watching because there was really not much happening there that you could really, take to the bank. But one of the stories that Ron has put out is this whole idea of the portal, and this has always been sort of a plausible deniability thing. It's always coming through Dan. And then a couple of weeks ago, Ron actually posted about the princess. And the princess is Aliha, who's his wife. And he writes a couple weeks ago, he said, one of the magical characteristics of the princess is her ability to change form, size, and shape. On occasion, she may appear 10 feet tall. Then a moment later, she is barely 5 feet tall. It is this magical ability that confused scientists for many years regarding the pod. Inside, it is a universe unfolding to her desires, yet outside, it is easily portable. So basically, he's talking about this idea that Aliha, apparently, as the story goes, may not be from here. She actually comes from the other side, and she was actually discovered in a pod, and that her stepfather actually brought her to America, and there was an encounter in 1983 with Ronald Reagan at the White House, and this is the basic story, and it's very hard to believe. A lot of people can't believe it. The key to this whole thing is the fact that this is Ron Pandolfi posting this, and he's posting under a name called the Foot Mann, but everybody knows who the Foot Mann is. So he's actually taken himself to posting this kind of stuff. And one of the interesting other developments that ties into this is that Ron was proposing to do a UFO sort of disclosure, a nonfiction documentary, which would be on the Avery. And the Avery was a group that started in the 1980s by a researcher by the name of Bill Moore, who gave a bunch of high-level government intelligence and scientific people code names who were providing him material. And these became known as the famous Avery. And they sort of have come and gone. Every time there's a major project that has come up, they have appeared in it. For example, the NIDS, which was run by Bob Bigelow. Bob Bigelow brought in a lot of the Avery people. There was a group known as the Advanced Physics Theoretical Working Group, which was headed by John Alexander. A lot of these people appeared in that group, and now they all seem to now be appearing in the Tom DeLonge operation. And that's where the second interesting posting by Dr. Ron Pandolfi comes from, is that because Tom DeLonge has all these sources, and some of them definitely are Avery figures. For example, John Alexander's name was connected. In the end, I don't think he joined the project, but Hal Puthoff, who sits on the board for Tom DeLonge, is an Avery guy. And what has happened in the last little while is that a guy by the name of Richard Doty has come forward, and he has appeared on Linda Howe's show, Phenomena Radio. He was interviewed by Dr. Stephen Greer for his documentary Unacknowledged, and then Stephen Greer released the 1.5-hour interview with Richard Doty. Richard Doty is going to be part of this 6-part documentary that is one of the disclosure efforts. There are as many as 6 disclosure efforts going on. Tom DeLonge's is one. This Hollywood nonfiction documentary will be another, and Pandolfi was the head of this thing, and one of the people that's going to be on it is Richard Doty. So Richard Doty has suddenly reappeared. He's supposed to be meeting with a friend of mine in England. There's a rumor he's going to be on Coast to Coast. So he has resurfaced, and the other one that has resurfaced is Robert Collins, who has reacted to a posting that I put up about Tom DeLonge, and I asked the question, why is Hal Puthoff involved with Tom DeLonge? And this guy who is known as the Condor in the Avery actually responded and said he's there to try to get Tom DeLonge on the right path. And he produced a book, and it's this book here, Exempt from Disclosure, which is written by Robert Collins, which is an extremely valuable book. It will basically give you the story of the Avery, and he writes from the inside, and it's an extremely interesting book. So he's come forward, and then that led to the latest posting by Ron Pandolfi, and then we'll sort of leave the update as it is. But this posting, I think, was just done today. It was sent to me by somebody. I really wasn't watching Open Minds Forum anymore, and it deals with Dr. Kit Green. So Ron Pandolfi was he is the CIA guy, as far as we know, the guy who runs the phenomenology or the UFO desk at the CIA, with all the weird remote viewing and psychic phenomena and UFOs and all that kind of stuff, and may have been running it since 1983, may have briefed the last 6 presidents on UFOs. The guy before him, his name was Dr. Kit Green, and Kit Green ran the desk, the UFO desk at the CIA, the weird desk, from 1969 to 1983. And he's also famous for being the head CIA guy that worked with the remote viewing program, which was run at SRI by Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ. So Kit Green is an open guy. He's now a contractor for various people, the CIA and other different groups. And Kit Green was indirectly mentioned by Tom DeLonge. Kit Green is working on a program at SRI at Stanford with a guy by the name of Dr. Gary Nolan, who's a famous scientist who was involved with Stephen Greer's little 6-inch alien with the analysis. And Kit Green and Nolan are working on a program where they have taken very highly psychic people, whether it's, I think Uri Geller they had, Ingo Swann, Joe McMoneagle, and what they've done is they've taken these people's DNA, and they've also taken DNA from experiencers, and experiencers who have interacted with the phenomena and have had injuries. So I know one particular person who went through the program and confirmed to me that this was going on. And so Kit Green started to talk to people like Andy Jacobson, who wrote the book Phenomena, and he started talking about this program that they're running where they're looking at the DNA. Now, the person who went through the program that I know had stated that he was told that every experiencer, and then I would assume that every highly psychic person, very highly psychic person, has a DNA marker that is there from birth. So that deals with the DNA, and Nolan is actually on the record as stating that a person's DNA, they can actually track back through the DNA as to when a person's had a cold, when they've had the flu, everything is recorded. And then you have the other aspect of this study that's supposedly going on at Stanford that Kit Green is doing apparently on his own money, where he's got over 100 people that are these experiencers, where they've looked at the brain patterns. And according to what Gary Nolan said in Annie Jacobs's book, Phenomena, there's a certain brain pattern that appears in all these people, and they're calling it the antenna, which is extremely important because it's a term that's also used by the Rama people, the Rama mission people, who are Latino contactees, who have what they call contactees or antennas, who actually predict the location and the time of sightings. It's different than a CE5, where they actually identify to the minute when the sighting will take place. And I was involved in one of these in August of this year, which was to the minute when they said it was going to happen. So this antenna thing seemed to be very important. So that brings us to today. And there's a guy who I also recommend to follow his research. His guy's name is Gary Beckham, and he runs Starstream Research. And he, like I, have been watching the Avery and these various players, high-level intelligence and military people for a number of years. And he made a posting today that was on Open Minds Forum. And he makes the posting to Dan Smith, who is the guy who was putting out Ron Pandolfi's stuff. And he's the best man for Ron Pandolfi's second wedding. He's the godfather to his child. And for the last 26 years, there's been this plausible deniability thing where Ron Pandolfi puts stuff through Dan. Dan repeats it, and the story gets out, but there's no confirmation of these various rumors. So Gary Beckham today asks a question of Dan. And what he says to Dan, and I'll read it. He said, "Dan, have you had any recent contact with Dr. Kit Green? I'm curious about the role he played in the Tom DeLonge setup. Kit has been looking for a public figure to push the interpretation of the disclosure of the core story." Now, the core story, for people who don't know, the core story was supposedly developed in 1987. It involved Jacques Vallée, Dr. Kit Green, and Hal Puthoff. And they met in a Denny's restaurant in 1987. And what they wanted to look at is there's a lot of UFO stories around, and what do we know for sure? And that became the core story. And what the core story was that, yes, we have been visited on a couple of occasions. There may have been a crash, and there may have been some back engineering of which we're not doing very well. So this question put on Open Minds today talks about Kit Green looking for a public figure, which I guess would be Tom DeLonge, to push his interpretation of disclosure of the core story. So Kit's version of the core story is the anti-best possible world, although he does not discount the possible role of ultra-terrestrial hypotheses in addition to the ETH. And this is the idea that when discovered, the phenomena is going to be much more complex than just ETs. So Kit Green goes along with this. Kit's version might also be called the burden of evidence version, in addition to the UAP type encounters cited by Chris Mellon. Gary Beckham continues. Kit always told us, like, I remember Kit Green was this top CIA guy, and he's had contacts with Gary Beckham. So Gary says, Kit always told us that there were 3 confirmed encounters. I recall they took place in the 1940s. This would be EBE-1, 1947. 1970s or early 80s, which would be the story of the EBE-2. And again in the 1990s, which would be the story of the EBE-3. And this was the one that supposedly was being kept as a visitor of the U.S. government off the mall in Washington, D.C. And people like Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray were following what was called bird code, trying to find this third EBE-3. And Kit Green has made these references to Gary Beckham. He was very ambiguous as to whether or not the 1990 encounters were at Skinwalker Ranch. The closest he came to a personal confirmation, and this is Kit Green, the closest he came to a personal confirmation was to tell us, believe it. So he puts this message up, and then instead of Dan replying to the message, which would usually be the case, and really doesn't mean much because he's the puppet, so you really can't tell whether he really knows anything for sure, the Foot Mann posted, and that's Ron Pandolfi. So Ron starts talking about the avians, which is this idea of the Avery, this group of people that was first put together by Bill Moore. And what he writes today on Open Minds is, the avians began their search for the visitor. An avian viewer searched the universe past and present for bits of information. An avian physicist examined gravitational wave anomalies from satellites orbiting the Earth. Now, Ron is sort of referring to himself there, because he was involved in a study on gravitational waves for the Jasons, which became public. And Ron continues, An avian medical doctor examined information from brain scans from the highest mountains on Earth. And this is an indirect reference that I mentioned just a couple minutes ago to the fact that Kit Green is doing these brain scans of highly psychic people and experiencers at Stanford University. So Ron continues, for a brief time, avians joined together in the working group. That is the group that was run by John Alexander in the mid-1980s called the Advanced Physics Theoretical Working Group. So he said the avians joined together in the working group to compare notes and connect the dots. Then the youngest avian was requested to attend a meeting at the White House. Now, the youngest avian would be Ron Pandolfi, because most of the other Avery people are much, much older than Ron. Ron, at the time when this supposed meeting at the White House took place, was 1983. He was just a graduate from getting his PhD. He had just started his work with the CIA and was working in the Reagan White House. The President of the United States took a few minutes to joke about old times when they could chat over fondue without the burden of wisdom. Then the ambassador walked into the meeting. Now, what Ron is referring to here is the ambassador is Aliha Pandolfi, his second wife's stepfather. The president and the avian, which is Ron, listened to the ambassador describe growing up along the banks of a lake in Kashmir, and how the small child, which is Ron's second wife, Aliha, had been found floating within an invisible pod. He had taken this child into his custody, but he soon realized that it was not an ordinary child. He then offered two gifts, the pod for the president, which would be President Reagan, and the child for the avian, which is Ron Pandolfi. She was just 5 years old during this visit. So this is 1983. Aliha Pandolfi's 5 years old, and she's in the White House, and that's where Ron is working. So he could continue to care for her. With his death, she would pass to the avian, the group, and the final chapter would unfold. Now, it's this sort of rhyme and riddle stuff that has always been part of the Avery. If you read the book by Robert Collins, you will see that he describes what was called the bird code, that they were putting these bird codes and they were using postcards, and this is the way this message seems to unfold. And the key to this whole thing, today's message, is the fact that Ron himself is posting. So we know who this guy is. He's not, some secretary down at the bottom. This could be the guy who briefed Trump. This could be the guy who actually is running the show, and he is now actually posting himself on Open Minds Forum. And that's extremely important because, as I've said in the last little while, and other people I think have confirmed this, that we have never seen as much disclosure and things unfolding as I've seen in the last little while. So that's to give you an update. We have, Richard Doty, who's suddenly starting to talk, and he's talking about seeing, a document, a 150-page document dealing with Rendlesham Forest. He's open, he's starting to talk, and you have this documentary coming forward, and now you have the guy who could be running the entire show, Ron Pandolfi, now posting on his own stuff on Open Minds Forum, and he's almost never posted. This is very rare that he's posting, and giving us a little bit of a clue that whether the story about the pod and the portal and all this kind of stuff, whether it's true or not, they certainly want us to follow this story, and they just keep putting it out. They've been putting this Avery story and the pod story and the portal story out for at least a year now, and I followed it very carefully, and we'll see where it goes. We'll update you as it moves along, and that's it for today's update. Thanks.